The storm that rolled into Dalloway, Vermont on October 9, 2004, wasn't expected to be anything more than heavy rain and wind. Locals were used to that. The town's emergency sirens didn't go off, no evacuation alerts were sent. It was just one of those autumn squalls that came off the mountains quick, made the roads slick, and knocked out a few porch chairs. But sometime around 10:40 p.m., the wind changed. Trees began falling across old telephone lines. The Delaney farmhouse, nestled half a mile off Route 12A, lost power just as 33-year-old Ruth Delaney was reading her youngest daughter to sleep. Her husband, Alan, was in the barn, trying to quiet their two skittish horses. Their oldest, Claire, had already gone to bed upstairs, headphones on, completely unaware that the last normal hour of her childhood had already passed. No one heard Ruth leave the house. Claire, now an adult, would later testify that all she remembered was waking up to screaming. Not thunder, not the wind, a child screaming. It was her baby sister, 1 year old at the time, left alone in the crib, soaked, cold, and crying. The window in the nursery was wide open, blown inward. A small trail of muddy footprints led from the hallway to the back door. They were Ruth's. Alan said he came in 10 minutes later and found the baby crying, his wife nowhere. Her phone was still charging on the kitchen counter. Her car was in the driveway, and her shoes were still neatly lined up by the mudroom. When the storm passed, it left more than broken branches and scattered trash. It left a hole in the Delaney home that would never be filled. Alan ran screaming into the woods, calling her name, getting soaked and scratched by pine branches. His flashlight barely worked, and every trail was washed out. The wind had pushed debris across their narrow driveway, blocking it completely. He couldn't drive out to get help. His cell phone had no signal. He ran to the neighbor's house, 3 properties down, arriving out of breath, covered in mud, screaming that his wife was missing. By 1 a.m., the sheriff had arrived, navigating around fallen trees. Flashlights bobbed through the flooded fields. Searchers slipped on wet grass and disappeared briefly in ditches. The wind was still howling when the first tracking dog was brought in. He followed Ruth's scent down toward the creek that split the Delaney property from the old Lutheran cemetery. But 20 yards from the water's edge, the dog stopped, spun in a circle, sat down. That was it. Her trail, if it was a trail, ended right there, in the mud. By morning, the story was already spreading. A mother vanished in the middle of a storm, barefoot and without a trace. Neighbors came to help. Volunteers from neighboring towns formed search lines, combing the tree line, dredging the flooded creek with sticks and poles. A local fireman found her jacket snagged on a branch half a mile downstream. But there was no blood, no body, just cloth. The creek had risen almost 3 feet during the night, and it was possible, the sheriff said, that she had slipped and been pulled under. But there was something strange about the whole thing. She hadn't taken anything with her. No bag, no flashlight, no coat, and no shoes. People don't just run barefoot into the woods at night with a baby asleep in the next room, unless something had terrified them or someone had forced them. The early theories split along town lines. Some believed Ruth had a nervous breakdown, that maybe the isolation, the storm, the pressure of motherhood had pushed her too far. Others whispered about Alan, about arguments heard through the woods on quiet mornings, about how he never looked anyone in the eye during the searches. But even he seemed genuinely confused, devastated. He cried in front of deputies, collapsed in the living room when they brought in cadaver dogs. He passed a polygraph, then begged for more searchers. "She's out there," he kept saying. "She wouldn't leave the girls." But within 48 hours, the storm damage made things harder. Fallen trees blocked service roads, mudslides made drone flyovers impossible. The local river was still too high to search safely, and the storm had dragged half the woods into it. Her scent, already fading, was lost to the saturated earth. Police brought in thermal cameras and infrared sweeps, but the cold made every deer and raccoon read like a person. Still, they searched, for days. And then the storm moved on. So did the news. The state troopers went home. The volunteers dwindled. Claire and her sister were sent to stay with their grandmother in Bellows Falls. Alan remained in the house for another 6 months. He never once changed the sheets on Ruth's side of the bed. What made it worse was the stillness. There was no crime scene, no struggle, no body. Just a woman who had walked out into a storm and never come back. a woman who had vanished in a place small enough that everyone knew her, but big enough to hide her forever. People lit candles, left flowers at the edge of the woods. But soon, even that stopped. Ruth Delaney became one of those names locals whispered, but never asked about directly. Still, there was one detail that wouldn't go away. A faint trail of mud, small and unmistakable, had led away from the house. But those prints stopped short, 20 feet before the creek, not dragged, not running, just stopped, as if she had vanished mid-step. And whatever happened beyond that point would remain buried for the next 21 years. At first light, the damage became clear. Power lines lay coiled like dead snakes across cracked roads. Trees had buckled in place, their roots ripped from the soaked earth. In some places, the storm had carved trenches through fields and buried gravel roads under layers of silt and debris. At the Delaney farmhouse, police placed yellow tape between the barn and the tree line, but the sense of urgency had already spread well beyond that boundary. Word had gotten out. Ruth Delaney was missing, and no one knew where she'd gone. State police arrived just after sunrise. With roads partially cleared, 2 K-9 units were brought in from Montpelier, along with a mobile command post. Within hours, the property was swarming. Volunteers signed in at a folding table near the barn. Everyone was issued a map, a whistle, and told to stay in pairs. It was wet, cold, and eerily quiet. Birds hadn't returned to the treetops. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, agitated by the scent of oil, smoke, and mud. The air still smelled like lightning. One of the dogs picked up Ruth's scent from her jacket and immediately pulled toward the back pasture, leading the handlers past the remnants of a collapsed fence. The trail moved east toward Wolf Creek, weaving through patches of storm-felled trees. It was slow, frustrating work. The terrain was treacherous, and every step came with the risk of falling through soft ground or being struck by shifting limbs. Near the edge of the creek, the dog paused, circled, and began to whine. The trail ended abruptly at the broken remains of a footbridge, washed out sometime during the night. The scent didn't cross. It just stopped. Searchers spread out across both banks, probing with sticks, scanning upstream and down. Some believed Ruth had tried to cross the bridge and slipped. Others wondered if she'd been carried by the current from elsewhere. But despite the heavy rains, the water wasn't deep enough in most places to conceal a body. Divers were called in, but they wouldn't arrive until the following day. For now, the creek was a dead zone. No answers, no confirmation, just rushing water and doubt. Around mid-morning, an elderly neighbor named Harriet Klein approached one of the deputies at the tape. She had walked over in rubber boots, holding a wet umbrella and looking shaken. She said she thought she'd seen Ruth around midnight, barefoot, soaked, standing just outside the gates of the old Lutheran cemetery. When asked why she hadn't reported it sooner, Harriet simply said she wasn't sure it was real. She'd taken a sleeping pill before bed and had assumed it was a dream. But now she wasn't so sure. She was just standing there, Harriet said, like she didn't know where she was or what she was looking at. The cemetery in question sat on a small rise, surrounded by trees and stone walls. It hadn't been used for regular services in over a decade. The church beside it was locked and boarded up. Deputies escorted searchers to the grounds and swept the property, checking every gravestone, alcove, and storage shed. Nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign Ruth had been there. But the timing lined up. The cemetery was less than a mile from the farmhouse and directly past the creek where the dogs had stopped. The story made its way to the press that evening. Local news trucks parked along the outer road. Reporters in waterproof jackets delivered grim updates. 33-year-old mother of 2, missing since last night's storm. Photos of Ruth smiling in her garden aired between interviews with townspeople who could barely meet the camera's gaze. Most were reluctant to say much on record. Dalloway was tight-knit. Gossip traveled fast, but loyalty traveled faster. No one wanted to accuse, no one wanted to suggest. Still, a few things were undeniable. Ruth had vanished without her shoes, coat, or car keys. Her baby had been left unattended. Her scent ended at a broken bridge. And now, someone was claiming she'd been seen in a place she had no reason to be. But despite the unfolding mystery, the evidence was thin. Police admitted they had no indication she'd been abducted. No signs of a struggle, no ransom calls, no footprints other than her own. But to those closest to her, none of that made sense. Ruth wouldn't have left the house without telling someone. She was careful, protective, the kind of mother who triple-checked the baby monitor even during naps. Something had scared her, or someone had come for her. By the end of day one, the search had turned methodical. Aerial drones scanned the ridgeline. Deputies marked grid squares across county maps. A second canine team was called in to retrace the route between the house and the cemetery. Teams with metal detectors combed the fields, searching for anything: a locket, a shoe, a discarded phone. But as the sun went down, the woods swallowed the light and the temperature dropped. Some searchers went home. Some didn't come back at all. Inside the farmhouse, Ruth's belongings remained untouched. Her purse still hung on the back of a kitchen chair. Her last grocery list sat on the fridge. A bottle of baby formula, half used, stood on the counter next to a pacifier. Her world had been left in motion, interrupted, not concluded. And that was the part that terrified people most. That there hadn't been a moment of closure, no sound of a scream, no final word, just a house filled with signs of life and the inexplicable hole she left behind. By the end of the second day, the official narrative remained frustratingly neutral. No evidence of foul play, search ongoing, weather conditions a complicating factor. But among those who knew her best, the silence felt deliberate, like someone had seen something but hadn't come forward, like something was missing, not just Ruth, but some key piece that would make the whole thing make sense. The search continued for days, but each yielded fewer results, fewer volunteers. All that remained were questions. If she had drowned, where was her body? If she had run, why leave her children? And if she had walked to the cemetery, who or what was she looking for? The ground had stopped giving answers, but the church beside the graveyard was still standing, locked, forgotten, waiting. By the third day, search operations were scaling down. The creek had been dragged, the woods combed. Drones flew over treetops that still bore scars from the storm, but there was nothing new to find. No fresh leads, no second footprints, no surveillance footage. Just silence, stretching into the spaces where certainty should have been. And in that vacuum, the town of Dalloway did what small towns often do. It filled the silence with rumor. The first theory was the most natural, that Ruth had drowned. The storm had turned Wolf Creek into a violent current. Some believed she'd tried to cross the broken bridge and was swept downstream, her body caught under debris. But the water levels had dropped. Deputies had walked the entire bank on both sides. Cadaver dogs had sniffed through the undergrowth. Divers had covered every viable pocket beneath the surface. And still, nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing that could explain where she'd gone or how she could have simply vanished in less than 10 minutes. Then came the darker whispers, that maybe Ruth hadn't left alone, that someone had come for her. Eyes began turning inward. Alan Delaney, her husband, had always been private, a quiet man who preferred his horses to small talk. A few neighbors remembered shouting from the house on more than one occasion. Others said they'd seen him drinking more heavily in the weeks leading up to the storm. One even claimed she saw him burning something in the backyard barrel the morning after Ruth disappeared, though she couldn't say what. Alan denied everything. He cooperated with the sheriff, agreed to every search, gave up his phone, passed a lie detector. But as the days dragged on, people weren't asking what he did. They were asking what he didn't do. It was on the fifth day that something unusual surfaced. A woman named Janelle Morgan, 35, local nurse, part-time jogger, walked into the sheriff's office and asked to speak off record. She said she wasn't sure what she saw, and she didn't want her name mentioned in the news. But after seeing the photo of Ruth and hearing about the cemetery, she couldn't ignore what had been bothering her. Around 11:45 p.m. on the night of the storm, she'd been driving home from a late shift at the hospital. The main roads were flooding, so she took a back route near the old Lutheran church. Just as she passed the cemetery gates, her headlights caught something strange. A man, tall, unmoving, standing alone in front of the church's side entrance. She said he wore a long black coat that looked too clean for the weather. He didn't wave, didn't react to her lights, just stood there, facing the door. At the time, she thought it was a priest, maybe someone checking on the property. The church had been closed for years, but sometimes maintenance crews or locals still used it for storage. Still, it stayed with her. He hadn't moved even a little. It was like seeing a statue. She drove home quickly, spooked but unsure why. After the news broke, she thought maybe, just maybe, what she saw had something to do with Ruth. The sheriff looked into it. He called Father Bernard, the last officiating priest connected to the church before it shut down. Bernard was elderly, retired, and lived 2 towns over. When reached, he was confused, said the church had been padlocked since 2002. No one had keys but him and the historical committee. He hadn't been there in weeks. No services were scheduled. No staff were assigned that night. When he was told about the man in black, there was a long pause. Then Father Bernard said quietly, "No one should have been there. Not at that hour. Not in that storm." Investigators visited the church grounds again. They rechecked every door, every shed, all locked. No signs of forced entry. The padlock on the main door was rusted but intact. Inside, dust coated every pew and window. No wet footprints, no candles burned. If someone had been there that night, they left no trace. Still, the report was logged, the area flagged. The idea of Ruth being connected to the church wasn't new. The neighbor's sighting near the cemetery and now the claim of a man standing at the door, it was too much to ignore. But the church had always stood on the edge of things, spiritually, physically, and now maybe criminally. The town had long avoided talking about it. Even when it was open, it felt more like a relic than a refuge. Over the next few days, that image, the man in black at the church door, became something more than a witness account. It became a symbol. The newspapers picked it up. So did the radio stations. Some called him a caretaker, others a stalker. A few even revived old superstitions about the church grounds being cursed. No matter how it was framed, it fed into something the town was already feeling, that Ruth hadn't simply gotten lost in the storm, that something or someone had been waiting for her out there. And yet, for all the attention, the tip led nowhere. No one else came forward. No other vehicles were spotted. No tire tracks were found on the soft shoulder where Janelle claimed to pass him. Just one woman's story, eerily plausible, but ultimately unprovable. The sheriff kept the file open, kept asking questions, but the trail grew colder with each passing day. By the end of the second week, the posters were fading, and the volunteers had returned to their lives. Alan rarely left the house. The children were staying with relatives indefinitely. The fields began to dry. The creek slowed, but the weight of Ruth's absence remained, pressing down on every room, every whispered conversation, every locked door. And at the edge of town, the church stood exactly as it had that night, silent, untouched, and harboring a history no one had thought to question, until now. The winter came early that year. By mid-December, Dalloway was blanketed in snow. The storm that took Ruth had long passed, but its shadow remained, stitched into the daily rhythms of the town. The church doors stayed locked, the farmhouse lights were rarely on, and the sheriff's department, once inundated with calls, now sat mostly quiet. Just one fading missing poster left on the lobby corkboard, curling at the edges. But behind that quiet, something had shifted. 3 months after Ruth disappeared, her husband finally cracked. It happened on a Tuesday. Alan Delaney walked into the sheriff's office just before noon. He hadn't made an appointment, hadn't brought a lawyer. He just asked to speak privately. He looked thinner, more worn than the last time deputies had seen him. He hadn't shaved, his voice shook, and what he said changed the entire tone of the case. He told them he'd lied, not entirely, but enough. The night Ruth disappeared, they hadn't simply gone about their separate routines, him in the barn, her in the house. They'd argued, violently. Not physically, he insisted, but words had been said that he couldn't take back. He claimed it started over something trivial, groceries or the barn debt or how tired Ruth had been since the baby was born. He said he remembered yelling, her crying, that she'd shouted something about not feeling safe, that she'd grabbed the flashlight and walked out the back door barefoot, still in her nightgown. He thought she'd cool off and come back in, but she didn't. For months, Alan had buried that version of events, afraid it would make him look guilty, afraid people would stop looking for Ruth and start looking at him. But guilt had been eating at him. He said he couldn't sleep, couldn't stand the way people stared at him in the post office, couldn't look his daughters in the eye without hearing Ruth's last words. He told deputies he was ready to take whatever came next. But what came was nothing. They pressed him on details, what time she left, what direction she went, whether she had a coat, whether he followed her. But his answers remained vague, almost rehearsed. He said the power was out, the rain was too loud, and that by the time he realized something was truly wrong, it was too late. There were no witnesses, no neighbors awake, no physical evidence to support or disprove his version. The flashlight was never recovered. Her footprints had already been documented by the time of the original report. Everything he said could have been true, or it could have been a carefully crafted half-truth. Word spread fast, not through the media at first, but through the town itself. Dalloway ran on whispers. A clerk at the sheriff's office mentioned it to her cousin. That cousin told the gas station attendant. By Thursday, everyone knew Alan had confessed, or at least that's how it was told. The nuance disappeared. People filled in the blanks. A few locals gathered outside the farmhouse that night, just stood there, watching. Alan didn't come out. The next day, a news van arrived from Burlington, then another from Boston. For 48 hours, Ruth's name returned to headlines. Husband breaks silence, Storm widow speaks, Delaney case back in spotlight. But without a body or a clear admission of guilt, the authorities were stuck. The county prosecutor reviewed the case, consulted state investigators, even requested a psychological evaluation of Alan's interview. But nothing rose to the level of probable cause. The confession wasn't a confession, not legally. There was no murder weapon, no blood, no trace of Ruth's remains, just Alan's guilt, his broken timeline, and a town teetering between outrage and exhaustion. The attention faded again, just as quickly as it had reignited. Ruth's disappearance didn't have the clean narrative that media outlets liked. There were no dramatic chases, no obvious villain, just a grieving man with a bad temper and a missing wife. By January, the story was buried beneath election news and national tragedies. The reporters packed up. The neighbors went back to work, and Alan Delaney, with the pressure building and nowhere else to go, left town. In early spring of 2006, the farmhouse was listed for sale. Alan didn't tell anyone where he was going. He signed the deed over to a distant cousin, packed his things, and drove out in the same rusted pickup he'd owned since before the marriage. Some say he moved north, toward the Canadian border. Others claimed he took a job on a dairy farm 2 states over. But no one knew for sure, and no one seemed eager to find out. The girls were raised by Ruth's sister in Bellows Falls. Claire, now in middle school, barely spoke for the first year after their mother vanished. Her little sister, still a toddler, grew up with no real memory of Ruth at all. Just photos and silence. Lots of silence. Despite everything, the sheriff kept the case open. Cold, but open. He said Alan's statement had been useful, if not for a conviction, then for context. But privately, investigators admitted they were stuck. The weather had erased too much, the timeline was murky. And without forensic evidence or a body, the chances of resolution grew smaller by the day. The town tried to move on. People talked less. Theories faded into quiet resignation. But there were still those who believed Alan knew more than he ever said, that his half-confession was a calculated move, a way to look remorseful without risking arrest. Others weren't so sure. Maybe he was just broken. Maybe Ruth really had run out into that storm, pushed past her limits, and disappeared before anyone could stop her. But whether she had left alone or been left behind, one truth remained. Ruth Delaney was still missing. And for those who remembered the early rumors, the footprints that ended too soon, the man in black near the church doors, Alan's confession didn't bring peace. It brought more questions. Because if Ruth had left the house barefoot with a flashlight, then what had she seen? And where exactly had she been heading in the final moments before she vanished into the dark? Time, in places like Dalloway, moves slowly, but it moves all the same. After the storm, after the headlines faded and Alan Delaney slipped away into anonymity, the town did what towns are supposed to do. It moved on. The children were raised by Ruth's sister, Susan, who took them in without hesitation. Claire eventually spoke again, though never about that night. Her younger sister, Lily, grew up surrounded by photos and stories, her memory of Ruth more constructed than real. They didn't visit the old house. They didn't attend the yearly volunteer searches that lingered for a few years, then quietly stopped. The farmhouse changed hands 3 times, once to a newlywed couple from Albany, once to a man who only stayed 6 months before leaving without a forwarding address. No one stayed long. The property never shook what people whispered about it, that something had once gone terribly wrong there. By the time 2010 rolled around, the Delaney case was more folklore than file. New deputies came into the force unfamiliar with the full details. The boxes containing Ruth's case were kept in the archives, poorly labeled, partially digitized, and covered in layers of dust that no one bothered to disturb. Occasionally, a tip would still come in. A hiker would think they found something strange. A teenager dared to camp near the cemetery and claimed to see lights in the woods. Each time, the call was logged, sometimes followed up, but nothing ever changed. No new evidence, no fresh leads. Ruth's case remained cold. Not closed, just cold. But not everyone had let it go. One man, retired Sheriff's Deputy John Markley, had never stopped thinking about Ruth. He'd been on the original search team. He'd held the flashlight that first night, called in the dogs, sat with Claire in the back of a cruiser while she clutched her blanket and stared out into nothing. After retiring in 2015, he moved into a smaller house on the edge of town. Most of his colleagues assumed he'd be golfing or fishing within a month, but Markley spent his mornings at the library, his afternoons on Google Earth, and his evenings reviewing old files he had copied before leaving the department. Ruth's photo was taped to his fridge. His wife called it the case that wouldn't let go, and it hadn't. In 2019, Vermont announced funding for a statewide cold case initiative. Grants were offered for ground-penetrating radar, new DNA analysis methods, and cadaver dog training. Dalloway, long considered too small to compete for attention, was surprised when Ruth Delaney's case was one of the first selected. The official reason: high-profile local disappearance, viable potential for new search techniques. But unofficially, it was Markley who made it happen. He submitted the paperwork himself. He'd highlighted inconsistencies, raised new questions about the original scent trail, and proposed multiple potential dump sites that were never thoroughly searched. That fall, for the first time in 15 years, a new team stepped onto the Delaney property. The current owners, a retired couple who'd only lived there a year, agreed to vacate for a week. The fields were scanned. Radar equipment traced the earth in long, silent rows. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect decades-old decomposition, worked for hours each day. The creek bed, once thought too shallow to conceal anything, was drained and excavated in 2 key areas. At one point, they found a scrap of torn fabric embedded beneath a rotted tree root, but testing showed it was nylon, modern, likely from camping gear. Not Ruth's. Forensic anthropologists re-examined her husband's statement. They noted the timing of the flashlight, the open window, the argument. None of it led anywhere. His confession, recorded all those years ago, was reviewed again. Still no probable cause. The church grounds were also re-evaluated, Markley insisted. But nothing unusual turned up. The structure was still sealed, the cemetery overgrown but otherwise undisturbed. And with no confirmed sightings, no physical link between Ruth and the church grounds, they couldn't justify tearing into it. Not yet. After 6 days of searching, the cold case team packed up. The report was filed. No significant findings. Another box was added to the archive room. Ruth's daughters, now adults, were briefed. They had long since learned not to expect closure. Claire was teaching in Portland. Lily had a child of her own now. They said thank you. They said they appreciated the effort. But neither returned to Dalloway. For most, that was the final nail. 2 decades was too long. Whatever happened that night, it would remain buried, either in the woods, in the river, or in the hearts of the few people who still remembered Ruth for more than her photograph. But Markley couldn't let it go. He kept the final report on his desk. He reread the transcripts, noticed things others had overlooked, the way the footprints ended too suddenly, the way Ruth's scent stopped before the bridge but then reappeared, faintly, on the far side days later, logged but dismissed as contamination. He circled phrases, highlighted gaps. He didn't say it aloud, But the theory forming in his mind wasn't just about getting lost. It wasn't even about Alan. He believed they'd been looking in the wrong place, that something had been right under their noses the entire time. By 2022, he was alone in that belief. Even the younger officers thought he was just an old man chasing ghosts, but he didn't care. Something about the church still nagged at him, the cemetery sighting, the man in black, the way the pastor's account didn't quite line up with the reported building records. He submitted one final request to access the church's blueprints and maintenance logs. The request sat in bureaucratic limbo for months, and then, in 2025, when the town council approved restoration work on the Lutheran church after 2 decades of decay, Markley finally got the break he'd been waiting for. A structure that hadn't been touched in 20 years was about to be opened brick by brick, and deep beneath its floorboards, something long buried was about to come to light. By the spring of 2025, the old Lutheran church at the edge of Dalloway had been abandoned for over 20 years. Its steeple leaned slightly now, warped by storms and time. The wooden siding had turned gray, flaked by long winters. Most of the town barely noticed it anymore. It was no longer sacred, no longer feared, just forgotten. But someone, somewhere, decided it was worth saving. A regional historical preservation trust purchased the deed, citing its 19th century foundation, and proposed restoring it as a community space. Plans were drafted, grants were secured, and a team of contractors arrived with little knowledge of what the building had once been connected to. On the morning of May 14th, 2 restoration workers were assigned to evaluate the floor joists beneath the pulpit. It was the first structural review of that section in decades. As they removed warped planks and rotted supports, they uncovered something that hadn't appeared on any blueprint or record, an old square wooden hatch. It had been reinforced from underneath with iron bracing, sealed tight, and then covered over again with floorboards nailed from the inside. No markings, no visible handle, just an invisible square cutout, hidden beneath layers of decay. At first, they assumed it was part of an original root cellar or a forgotten coal chute. The building was old enough to have several undocumented quirks. But something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't aligned with the architectural symmetry. It wasn't referenced in any of the archive diagrams sent by the Preservation Trust, and it wasn't a standard build. One of the workers snapped photos and sent them to the site foreman, who notified the town council and the Vermont Office of Historic Resources. What happened next was standard protocol. The site was shut down temporarily. A local official was sent to observe the opening, and someone thought to notify the Dalloway Sheriff's Department, just in case. Retired Deputy John Markley heard about it the next morning. He was pouring coffee when his phone buzzed, an automated town alert about delayed church restoration due to unexpected substructure. It didn't say much, but to him, it said everything. He didn't hesitate. He drove to the site, uninvited, arriving just as the structural engineers were prying the hatch open with crowbars. It had been sealed tight, no hinges, no latch, just pressure and old wood keeping it in place. As the panel came loose, a wave of musty, stagnant air poured upward, cold, wet, metallic. The kind of smell that told you something had been down there too long. What they found beneath wasn't a cellar. It was a chamber, roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long. The walls were stone, the ceiling braced with hand-hewn beams. No stairs, no ladder, just a drop of about 6 feet into hard-packed dirt. At the far end, barely visible in the low light, was what looked like a bricked-up alcove, not a door, just a recessed wall that had been sealed with uneven mortar. It didn't belong. It hadn't been there originally. The work stopped immediately. A forensic team was called in. The site was cordoned off, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the Ruth Delaney case was reopened. This time, not as a mystery, but as a crime scene. The following day, a small crew with protective suits and respirators descended into the chamber. They scanned for structural hazards, air quality, decomposition gases. Then they brought in ground-penetrating radar to examine the sealed alcove. What they found was confirmation. Something or someone was inside. The bricks were carefully removed, one at a time, revealing a shallow cavity behind the wall. Inside, curled tightly into a fetal position, was the mummified skeleton of an adult female. No attempt had been made to bury the body. It had been placed, tucked away, almost respectfully, though the circumstances screamed otherwise. The clothing was decayed beyond recognition, but enough remained for investigators to recover a partially preserved blanket, a strand of beaded thread, and, beside her left side, a flashlight, rusted but intact. The body was immediately suspected to be Ruth Delaney. The positioning matched what someone might do if trapped, curled for warmth, arms over her chest. There were no visible fractures, no signs of trauma. The cavity was dry, insulated. It had preserved her in a way no one expected. Back at the station, Markley stood in silence while the scene was processed. For years, he had suspected something was hidden on that land, something everyone else missed. But even he hadn't imagined this, that Ruth had been in that church the whole time, that she had died beneath the pulpit of a building meant to offer sanctuary, that her final moments had been spent alone, in the dark, waiting to be found. The news spread fast, faster than it had the first time. National media outlets returned. Old photos of Ruth were revived, side by side with images of the reopened crypt. Her daughters, now in their late 20s, were contacted by authorities and flown in for DNA confirmation. The remains were sent to the Vermont Medical Examiner's office for full forensic analysis. There was still no official statement on how she died, but it was clear to everyone what mattered most. Ruth had finally been found. As the searchlights dimmed and the crews packed up, there was a new silence, one not born of confusion, but of disbelief. How could she have been there all along, just a mile from home, just below the feet of those who claimed to be searching? It was no longer just a missing person case. It was something else entirely. And buried with her, just beneath the dust and decay, were answers that no one had dared imagine. The chamber beneath the old church wasn't listed in any archive, blueprint, or historical record. Not in county documents, not in the Lutheran registry, not even in Father Bernard's own handwritten notes from the late 1990s. The original church had no official crypt, let alone a sealed secondary space beneath it. And yet, it was real, cold, claustrophobic, and deeply wrong. The soil had never been disturbed for burial. There was no signage, no iconography, no holy markers. Just a single bricked alcove at the far end of a forgotten room no one was supposed to find. By the time forensic investigators arrived, the work crews had long been cleared out. The entire restoration project was shut down indefinitely. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, and deputies stood posted around the clock. Inside the church, beneath layers of dust, the trapdoor sat open, framing the square hole into the chamber below. An industrial floodlight was lowered by cable. The air was thick with decay, not of rot but of something long undisturbed, dry, heavy, dead. 2 technicians from the Vermont Medical Examiner's office descended first. The drop was awkward, nearly 7 feet with no ladder, requiring a rope and footwork against the walls. Once inside, the team confirmed initial reports. The chamber had no exits, no light source, no water access. The walls were stone and old, possibly predating the church itself. Moisture levels were low, the atmosphere stable. It was an ideal place to preserve something, or someone. The brick sealing the alcove had already been removed by the initial crew, stacked neatly to the side. Inside the cavity, the skeleton remained undisturbed. No clothing in the modern sense survived, only what looked like a coarse, tattered blanket or shawl wrapped tightly around the body. The position was unmistakably human, curled into a fetal shape, knees drawn up, one arm tucked beneath the head. The other hand was resting palm down over a small bracelet, plastic, faded, with 4 discolored beads that once spelled out a name, Claire. It was handmade, cheap, the kind of craft a 7-year-old might give her mother on a rainy afternoon. Beside the body, near the curve of the ribs, sat a flashlight. Rusted, dead, the glass lens long shattered, and wedged into the far corner of the space, partially decomposed but still legible, was a wallet. Inside, a Vermont driver's license belonging to Ruth Delaney. A few waterlogged bills, a torn grocery list, and a photo of 2 young girls with their arms around each other, the corners warped by time. There was no doubt anymore. This was Ruth. Forensic teams treated the scene with caution. Every inch of the chamber was scanned, photographed, mapped. Cadaver dogs, lowered into the space, immediately sat down at the alcove entrance, a signal indicating human remains. But there were no signs of trauma, no fractures, no blunt force, no visible binding marks on the bones, and no evidence she had been moved post-mortem. She had died here, right here, alone. The autopsy would later confirm it. The official cause of death, hypothermia and oxygen deprivation, likely due to entrapment in a sealed space with declining air. There was evidence she had survived for some time, possibly hours, maybe longer, before losing consciousness. Microscopic bone marrow analysis suggested severe stress at time of death, dehydration, panic, but no foul play that could be proved from the remains themselves. She had not been murdered in the conventional sense. She had been abandoned. Investigators debated how Ruth could have ended up beneath a church that had supposedly been locked for years. The timeline never made sense. She left her house barefoot during a storm, carrying a flashlight. Her footprints led to the edge of the creek. A neighbor claimed to have seen her near the cemetery. Then the sighting of a man in black outside the church. It all pointed here. But the question remained, how had she gotten inside, and who had sealed her in? The alcove's interior told part of the story. On the far wall, scratches were visible, small, desperate markings carved into the mortar with something sharp. They weren't words, they weren't coherent, just frantic lines, overlapping, layered. Someone had tried to scratch their way out or scream in silence. When news of the discovery broke, the town of Dalloway was paralyzed. Local news anchors delivered the update in quiet tones. Ruth Delaney had been found, not in the river, not in the woods, not dragged away or lost. She had been beneath the church all along, less than a mile from her home, hidden in a space no one knew existed. It reignited a collective guilt, how a mother had been missing for 21 years while her body rested beneath the very building where many of them had once worshipped, where they had lit candles, held potlucks, buried their own dead. The Delaney daughters, now adults, were notified by investigators. Claire, in particular, was shaken by the bracelet. She remembered making it, remembered her mother wearing it. To see it recovered intact alongside the body was a moment of overwhelming grief. It was proof that Ruth hadn't run, hadn't abandoned them. She had carried their love with her into the darkness. For Markley, the retired deputy who had never let the case go, the discovery was vindication. But it didn't bring peace. It raised more questions. Who had sealed the chamber? Why was there no attempt to get help? And why was the only exit designed to lock from the outside? There was no record of renovations in that section of the church, no construction logs. The alcove was not structural. It had been added later, after the church's closure. Theories emerged, none of them easy, and what they pointed toward would require more than forensic analysis. It would demand a reckoning with what the church, and the people in charge of it, had really become in its final years. Because Ruth hadn't died in a storm or from neglect. She had died in hiding, in a space someone knew how to close. And now that the walls were open, the truth was bleeding through. The discovery of Ruth Delaney's remains beneath the church set off a chain of questions no one in Dalloway was prepared for. Not just about how she died, but about why the space existed at all. The chamber wasn't an accident. Someone had sealed it intentionally. It wasn't on blueprints. It wasn't a basement. It was a hiding place, which meant someone knew she was there. Someone had either placed her there or had let her go there and never come back. As forensic teams cleared out and investigators shifted focus, a secondary team was brought in to go through the rest of the church. Not just the trap door, but the attic, storage rooms, office drawers. Anywhere records might have survived. The church had been closed for over 2 decades, and water damage had taken its toll. But in the back room behind the altar, hidden behind a crumbling false panel, they found something that would reframe the entire investigation. A rusted filing cabinet, half collapsed under its own weight, filled with handwritten ledgers. They weren't financial ledgers, not exactly. There were no bank account numbers, no formal receipts, just dated entries written in careful cursive. Each entry followed the same loose format: initials, a short description, a dollar amount, and one of 2 phrases: service concluded or sanctuary received. At first glance, it looked like a church's record of charity work, But the more investigators read, the less charitable it seemed. There were dozens of names, most reduced to initials. The pattern was unsettling. Many of the entries referred to women, some clearly in crisis, noted as pregnant, fleeing, alone. In several cases, they were referenced as being housed briefly or relocated. The dollar amounts beside their names varied, some small, $40 or $50, others much larger. One entry read, S.J., 2 nights, west stairwell access, $175. Another, M.D., no contact list, request complete, $300. Most damning of all was a single entry dated October 9th, 2004. It read only, R.D., sanctuary received, advised no further steps, no dollar amount, no follow-up. For investigators, that was the final confirmation. Ruth hadn't just stumbled into the church that night. She hadn't broken in or wandered by accident. She had been allowed in. Someone had opened the door. And someone had made a conscious decision to let her stay hidden. But when the storm hit and the trapdoor jammed shut, no one came back for her. She was sealed in, left to die in silence. A sanctuary turned into a tomb. The entry was unsigned, but the handwriting matched a series of other entries made between 2002 and 2006. During that time, the church had been operating in a strange gray area, technically closed but not yet decommissioned. It wasn't holding services, but the building was still accessible to a handful of key holders. One of them was a man named Eldon Voss, a former deacon, now in his 80s, who had relocated to a care facility just across the state line. When approached by investigators, Voss was polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little from those years, said the church had been in disarray, records lost, responsibilities unclear. But when shown the ledger, his demeanor changed. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he pointed to a corner of the page where a small cross had been sketched beside Ruth's initials. "That was mine," he said. "That's how I logged the ones I spoke to directly." His hands shook. He told them what he could, that during the church's final years there was an unofficial practice of offering short-term shelter to women in crisis, those escaping abuse, homelessness, or addiction. It had begun informally in the late 90s, but by the time he took over bookkeeping in 2002, it had become something more structured, quiet. Off the books, no paperwork, no questions. Sometimes a cot would be set up in the vestry, sometimes in the back hallway behind the choir room, but only for a night, 2 at most. The idea was spiritual refuge, nothing more. When asked about Ruth, he hesitated. Then, quietly, he said he remembered her. Not by name, but by her face. She'd shown up late at night, soaked from the storm, barefoot, panicked. Said someone had threatened her, said she needed somewhere no one would find her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call anyone. That was the rule. Offer shelter, offer silence. And so he did. He couldn't remember if it was him who led her into the trapdoor chamber or someone else. He claimed the chamber had existed long before his time and that it was sometimes used for temporary hiding when a woman felt especially unsafe. It had one way in, and once closed, it couldn't be opened from below. It was supposed to be safe, a place to wait until the morning, until someone came back. But that night, the storm intensified. Trees fell, roads were flooded, power was lost, and the next day, when he returned, the trapdoor wouldn't open. It was jammed, swollen from the rain. He tried again later, but by then the news had already broken. Ruth Delaney was missing. People were swarming the area. He panicked, told no one, and sealed the space. His voice cracked when he said it. "I didn't know she was still alive in there." Whether that was the truth or something he told himself, no one could be sure. The interview was recorded. Voss wasn't arrested, too frail, too elderly, with no physical evidence tying him to criminal intent. His role, while deeply negligent, didn't rise to the level of homicide. But to those investigating, it was clear what had happened. Ruth had been desperate. She had gone to the one place she thought would protect her. And instead, she had been buried alive beneath the very floor that promised refuge. A mistake. A system built on secrecy. And one man, too, afraid to admit what he had done. The investigation turned its focus toward the broader practice of these unofficial sanctuaries. How many other women had passed through? How many had vanished? The ledgers offered clues, but few real answers. Most initials couldn't be traced. Some had no names at all, just dates. The full scale of it would likely never be known, but Ruth's story was no longer lost. It was written, it was catalogued. And the ledger that once recorded her disappearance in vague shorthand had become the very piece of evidence that brought her back into the light. The pieces didn't fall into place all at once. They never do. They crept in through silence, an old ledger, a fading memory, a man too old to lie convincingly. And yet the version of events that emerged was still hard to accept, even for those who had suspected for years that Ruth Delaney's case was more than just a storm and a disappearance. What it revealed wasn't a conspiracy, not in the sensational sense. It was something quieter, more devastating. A chain of decisions made in fear, in pride, in the misguided name of protection. And at the center of it was a church that had offered refuge and then chosen secrecy over salvation. After weeks of interviews, one thread became clear. The night Ruth vanished, she didn't just run blindly into the storm. She ran with purpose. She went to the one place she believed would protect her, not because of faith, but because someone had told her it might. A friend, a neighbor. No one could say for sure who had whispered it. But it was a known rumor at the time, in small circles, that the Lutheran Church still took people in, quietly, without judgment, especially women. The church was technically closed, but Father Bernard, aging and clinging to old-world ideas of sanctuary, had continued to offer what he called safe refuge in rare, extreme cases. He saw it as a spiritual duty. But there were no protocols, no emergency plans, no backup system if something went wrong. That night, as the storm battered the town and sirens failed to sound, Ruth arrived barefoot, drenched, her coat clutched in one hand, her flashlight dying in the other. She told the priest she was afraid for her life, said her husband had threatened her, that she didn't feel safe in the house, that she had to hide somewhere, anywhere, just for the night. Father Bernard let her in. So did the deacon, Eldon Voss, who'd been staying in the rectory temporarily. Neither man called the police. Neither asked for details. Both told themselves they were honoring the tradition of sanctuary. In truth, they were acting on instinct and fear. Bernard feared being told he was too old to manage the building. Voss feared exposure of the church's unofficial practices. Ruth wasn't the first woman to knock in the dark, but she would be the last. When Ruth insisted she couldn't be seen, they offered her a place no one would ever check. The chamber beneath the pulpit. It was crude, but dry. It had been used once or twice in the past, always with the same understanding. It was temporary, and someone would return by morning. They gave her a blanket, a small bottle of water, and left her with the flashlight. Bernard promised he'd come back before sunrise, just as he always had before. She thanked them. She believed him. But that night, the storm escalated faster than anyone anticipated. The trap door, already warped from age, swelled with moisture. When Bernard and Voss returned early the next day, the hatch wouldn't budge. They pried, hammered, tried everything they could. But the wind was still howling. Fallen trees had already drawn attention. Emergency vehicles were combing the streets. And that's when panic took hold. According to Voss's later confession, Bernard made a choice that morning, a choice they both carried in silence for the next 21 years. Instead of alerting the authorities, instead of admitting they had hidden a missing woman in a space no one else knew existed, Bernard made the decision to seal the chamber. He told Voss they couldn't risk it, that if Ruth was already gone, there was no need to tarnish the church's name. And if she wasn't, then perhaps it was already too late. They bricked the alcove, moved the stone crates, and placed boards over the hatch. Voss walked away. Bernard stayed in the church a few more hours, staring at the floor, unsure whether what he'd done was merciful or monstrous. When the news broke later that day that Ruth Delaney was missing, they said nothing. They stood in the crowd. They watched the search teams fan out across the fields, and they said nothing. The trapdoor remained sealed, the brick wall untouched, and Ruth's name was never spoken inside the church again. Voss claimed he never stepped foot back inside after that week. Bernard continued to live nearby, but retired from any unofficial duties shortly after. Both men had convinced themselves, in time, that Ruth might have left before the trapdoor jammed, that she had wandered off, that maybe they weren't responsible after all. But that thin hope unraveled completely once her body was found. When investigators confronted Voss with the ledger, with the confirmation of remains, with the photo of the bracelet, he didn't argue. He just asked whether she had suffered, whether she'd tried to call for help. They didn't answer him. Father Bernard had passed away in 2011. He died without ever speaking publicly about the night Ruth vanished. But now, through Voss's words and the forensic evidence, his role was laid bare. Not as a killer, but as a man who let pride and image outweigh humanity. A man who chose silence over a life, and who built a wall, literal and symbolic, to hide a decision he could never take back. For the town of Dalloway, the truth hit harder than any theory they'd whispered about for 2 decades. It wasn't Alan. It wasn't a stranger. Ruth hadn't run, hadn't drowned. She had done what anyone would do, sought safety. And she'd been granted it, only to be erased by the very people who promised to protect her. It was a failure of courage, not cruelty. But that didn't lessen the weight. What remained after all the files were closed and the press backed away was a simple fact. Ruth Delaney had begged to be hidden, and the church had obliged, not with mercy, not with care, but with a door that locked from the outside, a door no one reopened until it was far too late. Here is the expanded Chapter 10. Ruth's final silence, word count, 500 exactly. For 21 years, Ruth Delaney's body lay just 6 feet below the feet of a community that searched endlessly for her everywhere else. The woods, the river, the fields, all scoured again and again, while the truth rested in silence beneath the floor of a church that had once promised her safety. When she was finally brought up, there was no drama, no spectacle. Just a stretcher carried up the narrow stairs, wrapped carefully, escorted by officers who understood the weight of what they were holding. She had never left Dalloway. She had been here all along. Her daughters, now grown women, stood at the memorial service held inside the restored church that had once concealed her. Claire, who still remembered the night she woke to her baby sister's cries, held a photograph of Ruth in her lap. Lily, who had no memory of her mother beyond the stories she'd been told, touched the bracelet that investigators had recovered beside the remains. They had waited their entire lives for an answer, but what they were given was not peace. It was confirmation of every fear they had carried since childhood, that their mother had wanted to live, had tried to survive, and had been abandoned by silence. The man who could have spoken, Father Bernard, was gone. He had died in 2011, never questioned in court, never charged, never made to stand in front of the family he had failed. The deacon's testimony, frail and halting, was the closest thing to truth the family would ever hear. There would be no trial, no sentence, only the acknowledgement of what had been done and what had been ignored. For the authorities, what left them speechless was not just the body found in the crypt, but the decades of oversight that followed. All the tips dismissed, the footprints that ended too soon, the eyewitness who claimed she saw Ruth near the cemetery. It had all been pointing to the same place, and no one listened. The church was rededicated that same year, not as a place of worship, but as a memorial to Ruth and to others who had been silenced in similar ways. Her daughters asked that her story be told honestly, not softened for comfort, not as a mystery, but as a warning. Ruth had not run away. She had not been taken by the river. She had not abandoned her children. She had begged for protection, trusted the wrong people, and had been sealed beneath the very place she thought would save her. Her grave marker, finally laid in 2025, bore only her name, her birth and death years, and a single line chosen by her daughters. She asked for refuge. She was not heard. And for the town of Dalloway, that truth cut deeper than any storm ever could.